from Georgia, so it's nice to be back in a place where I can say y'all and people not stare at me real funny. But I'm really glad that y'all took the time to come join us for this conversation this evening. I know that everyone's got a lot going on with classes, with the presidential debate tonight. I promise we'll get over in time for everyone to go back and watch that if they want. But again, I just really appreciate you being here. So I want to thank the Reif Center for Human Rights and Conflict Resolution here at CNU for sponsoring the event. Working with Professor Francesca Parente has really been a pleasure. We've been working, I think, on this for a while now, so I'm really glad that it's come to fruition. Now, I think it sounds kind of cliche to say that we need the work of organizations like the Reif Center now more than ever, but it's true. Across the world, we're witnessing a rise in nativism and nationalism and attacks on the human rights of marginalized communities. To give just one example, here in the US, in the past 9 months alone, we have witnessed over 520 anti-LGBTQ bills being proposed at the state and the federal level. Boards of education and politicians across the country are pushing policies to ban or limit or control how themes like Holocaust history and LGBTQ themes are taught, or whether or not they're allowed to be taught at all in high schools. And so I just am really appreciative to the CNU community for providing a space like this where we can get together and talk about these important topics. Now, before we dive in, I just want to give a little bit of background about how I came to this topic. Growing up, I never knew about the history of the Holocaust. I'm not Jewish, so I didn't know about it kind of through family history or family anecdotes, and unfortunately didn't learn about it in high school either. And so it wasn't until I went to college, and really I just needed a few hours to fill up my schedule one semester, and ended up taking a history class about the Holocaust. And it really just kind of blew my mind that I had gone that long without learning about something that was so clearly so influential in modern history. Afterwards, I decided to take every single course that my university offered on the Holocaust, Nazi Germany, World War II, all trying to come to an understanding of this period of history. And so after 4 years as a college student, a nice naive college student, I assumed that I knew every single thing that there was to know about the Holocaust in just 4 years, right? That was until my last semester. In fact, I think it was probably the last 2 weeks of my time as a student. A guest lecturer came to campus and gave a presentation about Hitler's Pink Triangle prisoners. And it was about the Nazis' campaign against people that today we would recognize as members of the LGBTQ community. And I remember sitting in that auditorium, it wasn't a whole lot different than this one, and feeling really unsettled, right? Because I had just gone through, again, 4 years of coursework and had never learned about this particular victim group, except for, in all the textbooks, it would always say, other victim groups, kind of a bullet point, it would mention homosexuals and then move on. But I was also really frustrated at myself, because it was at that point in time that I was in the process of coming out, trying to figure out what does it mean to be gay, especially gay in rural southern Georgia, but also for the first time discovering the existence of gay history, queer history, and how did I fit into it. And so I was really frustrated at myself that at that point in time, why had I never asked myself or my professors what happened to people like me during the Holocaust? And so eventually I did ask my professors, and they told me, well, essentially, after the war, no one talked about it, right? That homophobia was such a taboo that nobody, including the gay survivors, or the Allies, or the Germans, just no one talked about it. And so therefore there was no information. And at the time, what I had been like, 20-year-old Jake, I guess, was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Right? How can you write a history when there's no evidence? And so again, filled with a kind of naive sense of self-importance, I went to grad school and decided, you know what, I'm going to be the very first person to write about this history. I'm going to finally break this silence. And so I went eventually to Germany, to the archives, to do the research, and was expecting to find nothing, right? Because I had been told that no one talked about it, there was no records. So you can imagine my surprise when instead I found mountains and mountains of evidence in the archives. Everything from survivor documents to court records, police records, and even folks talking about it around the kitchen table. And so really that sparked a new set of questions. Like why, if there was this evidence in the archives, and I even as my German language skills got better, found out that there was even some kind of a baby first wave of scholarship that had been published about the topic, mostly, almost exclusively in German, but mostly by gay and lesbian folks themselves, beginning in the 1970s. How had that not made its way into mainstream Holocaust education by the early 2000s? And so really, that set me on the course of what became this book that I'm going to talk about this evening. Whereas I had originally started on a project that wanted to document what happened to queer and trans people in Germany from 1933 to 1945, ultimately became a project about how do societies remember the past. And more importantly, what happens when entire societies choose to collectively forget parts of the past. Right? What happens when we choose to ignore the suffering of an entire community? And more importantly, what futures can we build together when we remember the past? So to trace this history, I followed the story of a symbol that was at the heart of it all, and that was the pink triangle. But before I can talk to you about the pink triangle's legacies, I want to talk about the pink triangle's origins. Now, by the early 1930s in Germany, there was a small right-wing fringe party called the Nazi Party that was slowly gaining a considerable number of followers and therefore a considerable amount of political power. By 1932, the Nazis had become the largest political party in Germany, and in January of 1933, the party's leader, Adolf Hitler, was appointed Chancellor of the country. Now, this new Nazi government wanted to create a racially pure society, a new Germany based on what they defined as racial purity. And so it labeled several groups as not belonging to this new Germany that they wanted to build. And some of these groups, predominantly Jews, who the Nazis considered to be like the most fundamental racial enemy of this so-called New Germany, but also the Roma and Sinti communities, as well as Germans with disabilities. The Nazis viewed these particular groups as being fundamentally biologically flawed, and therefore they believed that essentially there was no way to cure these groups of their so-called flaws. And so that is why ultimately the Nazis' policies against these particular groups ultimately radicalized into genocidal policies of mass murder. Now, the Nazis also held several other groups and communities as being enemies of the state, even if their policies against those policies against those groups didn't ultimately become genocidal. Some of those groups included political opponents, Jehovah's Witnesses, prisoners of war, and folks that we would, again, today recognize as members of the LGBTQ community. These particular groups, the Nazis, essentially felt that with enough pressure or torture, these groups can be converted into giving up or changing their thoughts, their beliefs, or their actions, and then be reintegrated back into mainstream German society. Now, as you can see from the quote here on the screen, the Nazis were obsessed with understanding and then controlling human sexuality. Right? They believed that indeed it was the key to through selective breeding, reproducing the so-called master race. They believed that the most dangerous threat that LGBTQ folks posed to this new Germany was a threat to the German birth rate, right? That queer and trans people supposedly robbed the fatherland of future children. The other main point that I want to make that's really crucial to understanding this history is that the Nazis didn't believe that people were born LGBTQ, right? They believed that being gay, being trans, being bi, what have you, was essentially a lifestyle choice. So this misunderstanding meant that non-Jewish LGBTQ folks were not slated for mass murder and were not sent straight to the gas chambers. Again, as we'll see, the policies of the Nazis against LGBTQ folks could be described as essentially incredibly violent conversion therapy. But as we'll see, the Nazis' policies were also incredibly deadly. And they made it clear in their rhetoric on their campaign stops over the radio that there would be no room for what they called the homosexual lifestyle in the new Germany that they sought to build. Now, one of the very first things that they did upon coming to power was control access to information. Immediately, within the first 2 weeks of being in power, they banned all LGBTQ publications throughout the country. They burned over 20,000 books, articles, and rare artifacts from the Institute for Sexual Sciences in their infamous burnings in May of 1933. And at the same time that they were taking away all platforms for LGBTQ folks to speak for themselves, the Nazis were also ramping up their propaganda machine that played on Germans' fears by saying that queer people were trying to, quote, seduce Germany's children into the homosexual lifestyle. So really you see this two-pronged approach of propaganda of trying to essentially muzzle what LGBTQ folks could say for themselves, while at the same time pushing across the airwaves and in the newspapers incredibly homophobic and transphobic rhetoric. Now, the Nazis targeted anyone whose gender or sexuality did not conform to traditional ideals. So take, for example, Fritz Kitzing here, who you see on the left, who was a gender non-conforming person who lived in Berlin. Over the course of Fritz's life, the Nazis arrested them multiple times, particularly, and I think this is really interesting, under a law called Paragraph 361, which outlawed, again, in the Nazis' word, homelessness and begging, or panhandling. So essentially, this was a law against solicitation. And even though Fritz was assigned male at birth, it was pretty much only, Paragraph 361 was almost essentially ever applied to women, to women sex workers. So in this case, it seems like the Nazis at least acknowledged the gender identity of Fritz as a woman. Liddy Backroff, on the other hand, who you also see here, was a transgender woman whom the Nazis arrested and charged under Paragraph 175. Now, this was a particular law that criminalized homosexual acts between men specifically. And so at this particular point in the history, the Nazis did not acknowledge Liddy's own identity and instead charged her simply as a gay man. Other trans folks were arrested under a law called Paragraph 183, which is a statute against what it called lewd behavior in public, which was essentially disturbing the public peace. And this was because Nazi officials insisted that so-called cross-dressing disturbed the public peace. And so that's why we know that a number of trans folks were arrested under this particular law. If you are interested in this topic, might hear some folks who are uneducated on the topic say, well, the Nazis really didn't persecute trans folks because there was no law that criminalized being transgender in a way that there was a law specifically like Paragraph 175 that criminalized homosexuality among men. Those folks like J.K. Rowling, don't know the history, right? And don't know that the Nazis clearly used a number of different laws at their disposal to go after and target trans folks. The Nazis also targeted lesbians and arrested them under a number of different laws, including those that criminalize sex with dependents, sex with underage minors, and even some under paragraph 183 for causing a public disturbance. But one thing that I want to point out, and that the archives clearly demonstrate, is that the Gestapo and the SS needed absolutely no law whatsoever to be able to take a person into so-called protective custody and send them to a concentration camp. Now, out of everyone in the LGBTQ community, the Nazis considered queer men to be the most dangerous. So under that label, I mean any man who had sex with other men, so whether they were gay or bi or any other identity. And this was because, as in Germany, as was the case in other countries as well, who had positions of authority. It was men. So if the Nazis believed that any so-called deviance or crime among, that a gay man presented could pose a more direct threat to the running of the economy, the military, or national politics. And so they focused most of their efforts on queer men. Now, I've mentioned paragraph 175 a few times. This was their biggest tool that they had at their disposal. And I want to point out that paragraph 175 was not written by the Nazis. In fact, it had existed since 1871, when Germany was unified as a country for the very first time. So you would think, right, that inheriting a national anti-gay law would have been something that the Nazis found really convenient. But what they actually found was that the wording of that original version, they found way too constricting. And so what they did in 1935, which is the same year that they are writing their infamous Nuremberg race laws, they decide to amend paragraph 175, and the new version is what you see here on the screen. Right? It says that it is a man who commits indecency with another man, or who allows himself to be misused indecently, will be punished. Right? So I don't know if we have any law students in here. As a humble historian myself, I'm like, how do you define indecency legally, right? And that was the point. And they wanted that term to be left as broad and ambiguous as possible, so that prosecutors and judges could interpret it how they wanted to, with the sole purpose of being able to convict as many men as possible under the law. Now, again, I'll point out that this law was used against non-Jewish gay German men. If you happen to be gay and Jewish, for example, or lesbian and Jewish, the Nazis considered your Jewishness, your Jewish identity, to be kind of the paramount crime. And so you would have been charged or treated as Jewish and not necessarily for being queer. So one of the most shocking findings that I found in the archives was just how popular the Nazis' homophobic policies were among the general population. But honestly, maybe it shouldn't be so shocking, right? Because that's what fascism is. Right? It's not just a top-down form of government. It also creates an environment where ordinary people feel empowered to act on their own prejudices without reprisal. So the archives clearly demonstrate that ordinary Germans took it upon themselves to turn in queer and trans people to the Nazis in staggering numbers. In fact, even if we just look at paragraph 175 alone, we know that over 1/3 of all those cases that ended in a conviction were the result of civilian denunciations. Right, so these are people's neighbors, their bosses, their landlords, and in some cases even their own family members, turning them in to the Nazi officials. In total, the Nazis arrested about 100,000 queer men under the law, and over half of those were convicted. Now, we don't yet have accurate or cumulative statistics on the number of lesbians or trans folks who were arrested, as I said, because those Those arrests and convictions were often made under a multitude of different laws, and scholars are now working on it. But as this research has just recently begun to really be able to compile comparable statistics. Now, out of those who were arrested and convicted under paragraph 175, somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 so-called repeat offenders were sent to concentration camps. So these were folks essentially who had been arrested more than once under paragraph 175. Now, when folks were sent to camps, they were labeled with a color-coded triangle badge that was sewn on their uniform to mark their so-called crime. And those who were imprisoned for being gay were marked with a pink triangle. Of course, we know from the archives that lesbians and transgender folks were also sent to the camps. They did not have their own separate category here on the marking system, but they were often labeled with a black triangle, which was the badge for so-called asocials, or social deviants. This was kind of a miscellaneous umbrella term that the Nazis used to identify anyone who they felt didn't fit into their idea of the new German society and who already didn't have a separate category. So this included sex workers, people with alcoholism, unhoused people, people with disabilities, certainly, and lesbian and trans folks as well. Now, the pink triangle prisoners were subjected to harder work details and given less food, and the idea was that hard work was a man's job, right? So the idea was that in subjecting these gay men to more masculine conditions would somehow reorient them back to being straight. We also know that gay prisoners were subjected to incredibly violent, intrusive, and in often cases deadly medical experiments that sought to find a so-called biological cure for the problem of homosexuality. But despite the official policy of curing or re-educating LGBTQ folks in the concentration camps, the reality on the ground shows a different picture. Right? Because the Nazis, on the one hand, can say whatever they want to as their policy or what their hope is for the LGBTQ community, but the reality shows that out of all of the concentration camp inmates who were sent to the camps for being gay and were marked with a pink triangle, 2/3 of them were killed in the camps. So after the Allies defeated Germany in May of 1945, they were left with the task of how to care for the hundreds of thousands of concentration camp survivors who were now in their care. Led by the Americans, the Allies adopted a policy of releasing the survivors who had been imprisoned on the grounds of race, politics, or religion. However, they said that it was unsafe for the general population if they released so-called common criminals right out of the camps back into the population. And so since the prisoners with the pink triangle had broken a national law, the Americans considered them to be common criminals. So that meant that any pink triangle prisoner who survived their time in a concentration camp and who still had time left on their sentence, right? A sentence, I just want to remind you, a sentence that was given to them by the Nazis, was taken by the American liberators from that camp and transferred to local prisons where they were forced to serve out the rest of their terms. Sometimes that might have been 2 or 3 months, sometimes that was up to 3 years. Now, when the Allies also immediately sought to purge all Nazi laws out of the German Constitution and the German Criminal Code, but they decided that they would let the Germans themselves figure out what they wanted to do with paragraph 175. And so when East and West Germany were created in 1949, both of those countries had specifically the Nazi version of paragraph 175 written into their new criminal code. So Pierre Ciel, who you see here, who was a Frenchman who had been sent to a concentration camp during German occupation, said powerfully after the end of the war that liberation was only for others. Now, beginning immediately after the creation of West Germany, gay people challenged paragraph 175 in court. Right, they said West Germany, I just want to remind you, was the democratic half of Germany, right? It was America's ally in the new coming Cold War. So gay activists in West Germany argued that it was against the nature of the new democratic constitution to continue using the Nazi version of a law that was already, even before the Nazis, discriminatory. But West German courts continuously rebuked any claims that fascism lived on in this Nazi version of the law. In fact, in 1957, the West German Constitutional Court ruled once and for all that the country would keep the Nazi paragraph of the Nazi version of paragraph 175. It turns out they didn't just keep it, right? This is not one of those kind of outdated laws that kind of stays in the books that no one really cares about. They used it extensively. So if you remember that graph that I showed you just a minute ago, the number of convictions under paragraph 175, if you extend that to show the full life of the law, this is what it looks like. And so it goes down at the end of the war, but then you can see in 1949, with the creation of West Germany, the numbers just start rising all over again. So in the first 20 years of West Germany's existence, they used the Nazi version of that law to arrest 100,000 gay men. Right? That's the same number that the Nazis arrested during their reign. In 1963, the theologian and historian Hans Joachim Schoeps felt justified in claiming, as you can see here, that for homosexuals, the Third Reich hasn't ended yet. Now, debates around the legality of paragraph 175 are not the only place where Germans discussed the Nazis' LGBTQ victims. Right? It also came up in discussions around compensation and reparations. So what you can see here is a letter written by a man named Bruno Bouchard. He was a German who was arrested under paragraph 175 and spent 4 years in prison. Right? So after the war was over, he applied to be recognized officially as a victim of the Nazi regime, and which was important for him, right? Because in order to be eligible for financial compensation to help rebuild his life, to having his record expunged, he had to be officially recognized as a victim. The board that was reviewing such applications denied Bruno's application, and they denied it very explicitly because he was gay and had been arrested under paragraph 175. And actually, this is one of the very first documents that I found in the archives. And what was really unique about Bruno is that he did something pretty rare. He appealed the decision. And he actually appealed it again and again and again, which left a very rare paper trail for us in the archives to be able to not only see how he's presenting his own story, but also how and why the denazification board also rejected his claims. And so what you're seeing here is one of those appeals, and you can see that he has underlined, right? He's typed up his letter, but then he's using his hand to underline a section which I've translated for you here. He says that, okay, look, if my actions don't seem political enough for you, he just wants to point out that the only reason he was not sent from prison to a concentration camp is because the Nazis told him that he had to submit to so-called voluntary castration. Right? And so he says, such a brutal intrusion on a healthy human body was only possible in Nazi Germany and should be enough to convince you that I was a victim of fascism. Now, unfortunately, that was not enough to convince the board. They not only denied his application yet again, but turned him in to the police, right? Because if you remember, paragraph 175 was still in effect. Now, unfortunately, this is the last document that I was able to find on Bruno, and we don't know what happened to him after that. Now, I want to show you a clip. It's about 3 minutes long. It is a clip from a 2000 documentary called, just paragraph 175. It's a survivor talking about his time after the war as a gay concentration camp survivor. He goes on the record under the pseudonym Heinz F. It's in German, but there are English subtitles. So I'm going to just play that for you here.
Wie lange sind Sie in Konzentrationslagern gewesen?
Zusammen. Wir haben mal zusammengerechnet, ich glaube 16 Jahre.
Was haben Sie gemacht, als Sie zurückkamen?
Ja, wenn wir nach Hause kamen,
Ja.
ja, da bin ich ins Geschäft, elterliche Geschäft gegangen. Das ist mein Bruder führte, mein Vater war ja gestorben.
Und Sie Ihrem Bruder oder Ihrer Mutter erzählt, was passiert ist in den Lagern?
Ich habe mit meiner Mutter nie drüber gesprochen. Mit meinem Vater konnte ich drüber sprechen, aber
Warum nicht?
aus Scham. Meine Mutter hat doch nie was gesagt. Das ist alles natürliches Haben.
Aus Scham, worüber?
Meine Mutter hat die Ausscham gestimmt. Oder aus überquellendem Mitgefühl vielleicht, um mir auch nicht zu beleidigen oder es mir noch schwerer zu machen. Nicht einfach, dass die
Heute ist es ganz schwer vorzustellen, dass Sie diese schrecklichen Jahre überlebt haben und zurückkamen und
ist kein drüber sprechen konnten. Ja. Hab nie mit jemandem drüber gesprochen.
hätten Sie gern mit jemandem darüber gesprochen?
Vielleicht. Vielleicht mit einem.
Haben Sie später mit anderen darüber sprechen können?
Nee. Es wollte auch keiner hören. Hätte man bloß irgendein Stichwort sagt und ist nicht mit dem Kram zufrieden. Schnell mal vorbei und damit ist erledigt.
So I think one of the things that makes Heinz's story so heartbreaking is knowing that it's just one of thousands. So when I first started this research, folks had often told me, I guess maybe because it sounded really marketable, that LGBTQ folks were one of the Nazi so-called forgotten victim groups, right? But I think it's clear, even just from these two examples, that we've seen no one forgot about it. No one forgot what happened to them. Germans knew what had happened to them and agreed with it, right? They continued to discriminate and persecute the LGBTQ community. So some men, like Bruno from the slide before, broke their silence and told their story. But folks with more power, right, like government officials, told him to be quiet, right, because he was not really a real victim. He was a criminal. The stifling environment of homophobia forced many men like Heinz here to keep his memories hidden, right, never to speak of them, not even to his own family. So writing this book has taught me a lot about the nature of silence. Right? I always thought about silence as a noun, right? The absence of sound, or in this case, the absence of memories, the absence of people talking about something. But what we see here, and again, is silence as a verb, right? To silence someone. West German politicians, judges, historians, journalists, and the public had silenced the Nazis' LGBTQ victims for decades. But by the 1970s, gay activists were about to break that silence once and for all. Sorry, Heinz, we're going on. In the early 1970s, a political gay liberation movement emerged in West Germany, and activists in this new movement sought to mobilize queer people across the country into political action. At this time, in the 1970s, coming out was a political strategy, right, of publicly claiming a gay identity. This is because in the past, activists had argued for the right to privacy. Right? Essentially, they argued that the government had no right to discriminate or persecute LGBTQ folks as long as LGBTQ folks stayed in the privacy and really the safety of the metaphorical closet. But the politics of coming out asserted something different. Right? They asserted that citizens in a democracy had every right to express their sexuality openly and freely. So West German gay activists suggested that they all collectively out themselves to the mainstream society by wearing a gay symbol. But of course raised a lot of questions, right, of what would that symbol be. In 1972, a publisher in Hamburg released a short book that would ultimately come to have monumental impact across the world. Written under the pseudonym Heinz Hager, it was the very first book published by a gay concentration camp survivor to tell their own story. And the title, which in English is The Men with the Pink Triangle, offered a solution to the problem of visibility. Activists knew that their West German counterparts would instantly recognize the pink triangle as a concentration camp symbol, and thus be forced to face the fact that their own history wasn't completely in the past yet. So in March of 1972, a group in Frankfurt, Germany, a pretty leftist radical group called Rot-Schwul, became the very first organization in the world to reclaim and use the pink triangle as a symbol of LGBTQ pride and liberation. Now, these West German activists knew that their reclamation of the pink triangle represented a fundamental transformation, yes, of a particular symbol, but also of an identity as well. The original pink triangle had labeled being gay as something, right, that was criminal and worth punishing. But they reclaimed the symbol and asserted that being gay was in no way shameful. And they robbed the pink triangle of its negative power by saying that being gay is not an insult anymore, and in fact we're going to wear this symbol as a badge of pride. Now, the reclamation of the pink triangle originated in West Germany, but it didn't stay there for very long. In August of 1974, the Gay Activist Alliance in New York City planned a rally in the support of a gay rights bill that was before the city council, and they designed and wore the buttons that you see here. It was the very first documented instance of the pink triangle's use as a gay rights symbol in the United States. But from there, it spread across the nation. Gay activists used the pink triangle and the history that it represented to call out homophobia, but also to promote equality. And they did so from New York to Miami, DC, San Francisco, and ultimately everywhere in between. Now in America, just like in Germany, gay activists understood that their use of the pink triangle was a transformation of something that was negative into something that could be powerfully positive. The Jewish and lesbian activist Martha Shelley told me in an interview that the pink triangle also had the added benefit of giving the middle finger to the Nazis. Now, by the early 1980s, the pink triangle had become the most widely used and recognizable symbol of LGBTQ activism across North America and Europe. And you can see, even just from a collection, a small collection here of some of the ways it was used, it resonated with communities from multiple ethnicities and backgrounds and from various gender identities and sexual orientations. It was in 1986, though, that a group of activists and artists in New York City catapulted the pink triangle into the public consciousness in a new way when they designed the now iconic Silence Equals Death poster. Now, this poster was meant to motivate people to take action during the AIDS crisis. The following year, 1987, the AIDS activist group ACT UP adopted the poster, and ultimately the pink triangle became a visible symbol of AIDS activism across the globe. But the pink triangle was never only about politics. Transgender activist Nancy Nangeroni used symbolism as a means of bridge building. So as she told me in an interview, there was a lot of homophobia in the trans community and transphobia in the gay community back in the 1990s. So she tried to build solidarity among these two communities when she designed this pin and a t-shirt. They combined the symbolism, both of the pink triangle and a transgender symbol. Intersectionality also prompted Jose Gutierrez to form Triangle Rosa, which was a gay support group for Latino gay men and lesbians in Washington, D.C. in the 1990s. Jose has spoken very eloquently and powerfully about what the pink triangle meant to him as a Mexican American who had no really direct ties to the history of the origins of the pink triangle in Germany. He said that he felt connected to it because the pink triangle had, quote, come to represent a queer community, a gay identity that transcended national borders and had a shared history. Now, for Black and queer writer Cheryl Head, it was that history that gave the symbol its power. For the first time that she saw the pink triangle was on one of those Silence Equals Death posters. But she told me that the poster would not have been as meaningful or as powerful to her if she had not already learned about the history of that symbol. Unfortunately, that history was still under attack. Professional historians and museums, academic journals, all refused to publish the research that queer scholars and grassroots scholars had conducted from the 1970s into the 1990s. So as late as 1996, a state archive in Hamburg, Germany, got caught actually destroying case files on the Nazis' gay victims. When they were asked about it, they said, well, they were actually just making more room for what they called more archive-worthy material. And so you can see, this is a newspaper clipping about that scandal, again, as late as 1996. But as I mentioned, since the 1970s, a handful of grassroots scholars had risked their reputation and their livelihoods to research and try to tell this history, to be able to get it beyond just the queer community and acknowledged in mainstream society. And to this day, it's still a very small community of us who are working to research and tell this history. And my own book and my own work would not be possible without the folks that you see here on the screen. Now, in 2002, the German government finally recognized the men persecuted under paragraph 175 as official victims of the Nazi regime. That means that they were finally eligible for compensation. But at the time of that announcement in 2002, no gay survivors came forward to claim that compensation. At the time, the youngest would have been well into their 80s. And for their whole lives, Germany, under multiple administrations and governments, had told them that what they went through was not injustice, persecution, but was instead constitutional punishment for what they had done, or who they were. So to this day, not a single cent of official reparations has been paid to the Nazis' gay victims. And now we come to the conclusion of my talk. Right, today, the rainbow is the symbol of the global LGBTQ community. I'm sure if you ask anyone in here or out on the quad, what's the symbol of the gay community, would be pretty hard pressed to find someone who said the pink triangle. In a lot of ways, it turns out that the rainbow flag was designed to be the antithesis or the opposite of the pink triangle. Because in 1978, activists in San Francisco said that the pink triangle focused too much on a negative history. And instead they wanted something that was more uplifting that the LGBTQ community could take pride in. And so what they developed was the very first rainbow flag that flew in San Francisco during the Pride Parade that year. By the late 1980s, the rainbow had spread to the East Coast and became adopted primarily among LGBTQ folks who felt that some gay groups like ACT UP, who used the pink triangle, were too radical. So the rainbow became more widespread. But I would argue that in order for it to become so widespread, it also had to be tamed. Right? In order to be more acceptable, it had to become less radical. In a lot of ways, the rainbow, this gay symbol that had originated as a symbol of gay pride, has now been turned into a PR tool or a marketing tactic. Each June, corporations turn their logos into rainbow, they make tons of money, but then July comes around and the rainbows disappear. Now, despite the cliches, there's not a rainbow at the end of every storm. In the 1920s and early 1930s, when Germany was still a democracy, there were a number of conservative parties in Germany all vying for votes. Each of these different political parties had different stances on politics, the economy, and cultural issues. Now, the Nazi Party was politically savvy. They revved up their homophobic rhetoric because they knew that doing so would rile up their base and unite the factions of the right in a way that other issues wouldn't. Right? And history shows us that it worked. Now, does any of that sound familiar? Right? It should. Homophobia and transphobia have long been tools of conservative extremists. Politicians and the media today call queer and trans people groomers who are threats to children. In turn, ordinary people feel allowed or even empowered to carry out violence against queer and trans people. So in the era of Don't Say Gay laws, of increased violence against queer and trans people, we need the pink triangle more than ever. If we are to truly honor those who wore the pink triangle originally in the camps, we have to do three things. First, we have to remember, right? We have to tell the truth and free this history from the closets. This can no longer be just a history that is known by or told to the queer and trans communities. Because when we separate this LGBTQ history from the history of the Holocaust, for example, folks don't realize just how dangerous and lethal homophobia and transphobia can be when it's backed by the government. We also miss the incredibly striking parallels in the rhetoric used by politicians in the 30s and those that's used today. But it's not enough to remember, right? Remembering must have consequences. So second, we have to act. We have to push back against homophobia, whether it's around the kitchen table, on the campus, or in the workplace. And yes, we have to fight transphobia on election day. We also have to do it every single day. And finally, and I think this is the most important, but also probably the most difficult, we have to show up for each other. Right? We have to recognize that the fight against transphobia and homophobia must, by necessity, also be the fight against anti-Semitism, ableism, and racism, and all the other forms of dehumanization and marginalization. I'll end with this. The LGBTQ community has every right to exist, and not just quietly in the closet, but openly in books and TV shows and movies and high school curriculum. Every single way that we collectively talk about the world, we have the right to be visible. the history of the pink triangle shows us what happens and how far homophobia and transphobia can go. Right? But it's up to us to decide how far we let it go today. Thank you very much.
All right, we probably have time for just one or two questions before I'm sure what we've all been waiting for, which is of course the book raffle. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Nisa?
I have a question, but I want a student to go first.
We got some students over here.
Yeah, sure.
How long did it take you to write your book?
Oh, that's a good question. It took me about 10 years. 10 years of research and revisions and writing, but yeah.
Were you in Germany the entire time?
I was in Germany for about 2.5 years of the time, yeah, to do research. Good questions. Yeah.
When you're writing this book, you're writing about these people's like past experience. It was like really hard to hear.
Yeah, it was incredibly hard to hear because as I said at the beginning, right, this was always a kind of academic, professional research project. It was also a personal project, right, because I was researching people like me, right, whose fate might have been my own if I was born in Germany at that time. And so there were certainly numerous times where I would have to take days or weeks off to not think about the content. Especially, you know, this is not going to sound very profound, but it didn't surprise me that the Nazis were homophobic, right? Like I might not have known the details of like the number of people that were sent or like the laws, but it wasn't super shocking that they went after LGBTQ folks after I learned about it. What was the most shocking to me were reading the stories like Bruno's and Heinz's, right? Who were in this new democratic society, right, that supposedly upheld the liberal freedoms of everyone, who were being told time and time again, simply to shut up or we'll send the cops after you. And to me, that I think was the hardest, those were the hardest stories to read. Thanks.
Do you know if there's a push for a Holocaust museum focused specifically on the LGBTQ community?
No, not that I know of, but so not a whole museum dedicated to it, but there certainly are a number of memorials now that, as you can probably imagine, had to face a lot of backlash beginning in the 80s even to have a memorial to recognize the Nazis' LGBTQ victims. And in fact, the very first was proposed in 1985, but it wasn't even allowed to be placed until 1995. And the very first monument to lesbian victims was not allowed to be placed until 2023. Right, so this is still a topic that is very much up for debate. And so I would say, you know, while there's not a museum, each of these, each of these monuments do have informational plaques or companion websites, because they know that one of the best forms of commemoration or memorialization is through education. And so they try to make information available to folks who come to visit the monuments. Thank you.
Do you know if in Germany, like, you still have some groups using the pink triangle, or have they adopted the rainbow, like,
The rainbow is pretty ubiquitous in Germany, but I would say, you know, in the last 5 years or so, there has been a resurgence in Germany and America and across the world to say, you know, enough with the rainbow washing. We need to go back to the pink triangle as a more kind of in-your-face reminder of what happens when we don't confront homophobia or transphobia. And so we actually see some really interesting examples of, for example, Black Lives Matter activists using the pink triangle as a way to showcase like intersectionality of queerness and race. And also like I said, in Germany, there's also a movement to reclaim what they rightfully call the original gay rights logo. I have lots of thoughts. I know we want to have questions. I have lots of thoughts of the rainbow versus pink triangle, but we'll take another question.
Do you know if any countries after the Holocaust took inspiration from the Nazi laws and treatment about homosexuals? Or do you think it was just like pretty common methods?
I mean, it was, institutionalized homophobia was pretty common at the time, right? So it really shouldn't, to me, right, it shouldn't be as much of a surprise that the Allies, who had anti-gay laws, in the home country, didn't suddenly become gay activists in Germany and say, like, look, we're going to free all the gay survivors. I would say one of the interesting things is that this is a moment in time when the U.S. actually ramps up their persecution of queer folks in the federal government. And so after the war's over, they initiate what's now kind of known as the Lavender Scare, in which they purge tens of thousands of men and women who were even accused of being LGBTQ, like fired them from the federal government. And what's interesting in terms of your question maybe of models or who influenced who, is that the West Germans in the early 1950s, who were, most of them were, a lot of unrepentant Nazis who got their jobs back essentially in the West German government, said, look, if even the USA, the land of the free, is purging gay folks from their federal government, we need to really stick to paragraph 175. And so in a way, America kind of became a model for persecution after the war was over.
Okay.
All right, let's take one last question before we do the raffle.
Okay, right here.
When you're looking through the records that show like the pink triangles for the gay men who are prosecuted, how do you determine like any other category for the black triangles who were lesbians and transgender and other members of the community?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and a lot of times it's difficult. But sometimes it's pretty straightforward. Like you'll see a admittance card, like they had insurance cards where the Nazis would like write down their name, their occupation, why they were being arrested, and sometimes it would just simply say lesbian, or like known to visit lesbian bars. And so even though they were marked with the black triangle, or sometimes we even have examples of lesbians who were marked with the red triangle, which was for political opposition. And so maybe they were arrested because they were also like communists and were like fighting against the Nazis, but the Nazis still took time to write down that, hey, this woman is also a lesbian. For trans folks, it's more difficult because the Nazis really did not recognize transness as a legitimate identity, right? They just said, this is a cross-dressing homosexual man. And so a lot of times trans women would have been also marked with the pink triangle because they would have been treated as a gay man in the camps. So we also know that like for those who were marked with the black triangle, which would have been primarily trans men, like they would say things like, known to frequent transvestite clubs or locales, right? So you can see the Nazis actually like writing that on those cards. But in other times, again, you might just see paragraph 183, like cause of public disturbance. And so it might not ever be possible to accurately gather those statistics in the way that we have for gay men under paragraph 175.
All right, I know that many of you have other questions, but it is 7:01 and I did promise this would end at 7. So please, I guess we'll do the raffle first and then we'll give a round of applause to Dr. Newsom. So who would like to do the honor of drawing? Sam, do you want to draw?
Sure. While you're drawing, I'll just say, if you can go to my website here, and if you have questions, you can find the contact box or my email address, and you can just email me directly if you ever have questions. And you can also check out, there's a lot of opportunities to get involved with the project there.
All right.
Flowers in my hands.
Yes, we are very powerful here. So if you don't win, it's not my fault. We have them.
Helen counts.
Helen counts?
Helen?
All right. Congrats. Okay. And you will be able to get it signed by Dr. Newsom.
Caitlin King.
Shit.
All right. Okay, and last but not least,
Rose Perkins.
All right. A round of applause for our raffle winners. Please come up to get your book signed. Thank you so much to everyone who came out to our event. It's so amazing to see so many of you here. Our next event is Thursday. What month is it? September 19th. It will be with Dr. Deepti Mehta, which will actually pick up on some of these themes, talking about the invisible fabric of the patriarchy. If you would like to pre-register to attend, you can scan this QR code here on your way out. Otherwise, you will be bombarded with campus emails about attending